Hello guys, in this video I'm going to be building this Kfz.13 German Scout Car in 1/35th scale. This kit is actually a 3D printed kit made by Sparty72 from Kfz.13.com. If that name rings a bell to you, it might be because the same creator made the IF8 supply trailer which I built in a recent video. Now that supply trailer was excellent, so I was really keen to try out this Scout Car. As you can see from the Kfz.3D page, it looks like it has a lot of detail. And in fact, Mark, the creator of this model, has a lot of other models available on Kfz.3D, so I definitely recommend that you check those out. Quite often these are things that are hard to find in regular injection molded kits, so definitely worth a look. Before we begin, a quick bit of background on the Kfz.13. This is actually an interwar vehicle, and it was created in the 1930s, in that period where Germany was starting to rearm itself. It was designed and created by Daimler-Benz, and to keep costs low, it was built on the Adler Standard 6 passenger car chassis. Some sources say that this was never really intended as a vehicle to go into combat, but merely to sort of train crews and get experience in how to correctly manufacture armoured vehicles. Being a scout vehicle, it's very lightly armoured, and it has a simple MG13 machine gun to defend itself. The Kfz.13 doesn't even include a radio for communications, although there is a later version, the Kfz.14, which has the radio in place of the machine gun. Almost 150 of these vehicles had been built by 1935, and the Kfz.13 was then deployed in the invasion of France and the invasion of Poland. However, of course, even then it was somewhat obsolete, and by 1941 it was withdrawn from service and only used for training purposes. Moving back to the kit, and the reason I call this a kit is because unlike a lot of 3D models, this downloads in several separate parts, which you then print and put together like a regular kit. You can see here the main body of the car, with lots of detail on the floor and the engine and so on. Here are some of the smaller parts, so the mudguards and the door and the engine cover. There are a total of 35 parts, although actually the count is slightly higher than that because some of the parts, like the wheels, need to be printed more than once. Some of them are very fine, and to be honest, I was quite cynical about whether or not my printer would be able to reproduce these without any warping or damage, but I was very pleased to see that they came out very well indeed. Of course, when we 3D print things, we have to add supports, and for various technical reasons, on a resin printer, it is better to print things at a 45-degree angle. So the first step of the post-processing is to remove those supports. It's better to snip them off, as I'm doing here, than to snap them off, because if you snap them off, it tends to take a small amount of the actual model away with them, and you end up with these little divots all over the model. Here you can see the main body of the car with the supports removed. There is some cleanup I need to do there, some sanding on the bottom, but much less on the top, in fact virtually none on the top, simply because there were no supports there. Here are the wheels. Again, the detail's very nice, with a small amount of cleanup needed on the inside. None of that cleanup is the fault of the model, it's simply the way that I decided to support it. I really like this rear wheel, this spare wheel cover here. The folds in the fabric, they just look so nice. And this hole in the back here is a really good indication of the quality of this kit, because it just aligns perfectly with that little nub on the back there. It sits perfectly on the back of the car. Here are some of the smaller pieces. So this is the engine guard. Again, I arranged it so that those supports are on the inside face that you won't see. And here are some of those tiny pieces, the gear lever and the handbrake. You can see there the supports are almost as thick as the pieces themselves, so I did have to be very careful removing them, but they did come off without a hitch. And of course, one of the advantages of a 3D printed model is if you do break the piece, you can always print it again. There's a bit of a close-up of that front, including the grille. I'll keep that wheel separate for painting. You can see the non-slip texture pattern there in the bottom. and also those grooves and that square at the bottom of the car, they will become relevant shortly. But before I proceeded, I wanted to remove any of the support nubs from the underside, especially from the outside where they might be seen. To do this, I prefer to use a metal file. Now, resin dust isn't something you want to be breathing in, so I am wearing a respirator here. I'm wearing gloves. I'm doing this over a damp paper towel so that hopefully that will catch any of the dust that falls onto my desk. And I have dampened both the file and the model slightly as well, again to reduce the amount of dust. Overall though, I would say the amount of cleanup needed on a kit like this is less than you would need on a regular resin kit. I remember when I made the Rex Zero diorama, and that needed a lot of cleanup. To be honest, I could have done a better job at cleaning up the underside. But to be honest, I thought it's not going to be seen, and I was quite keen to get on with building this model. First up was the front suspension. And although I don't think you can see it so well on the video here, but there are small grooves on the underside that help you align that. I don't know if you can see that super well, but if we go back to the CAD image, hopefully you can see there's that small groove at the front and another one there at the back, and they've printed exactly like that, so it does help guide that front suspension. To be honest, I've seen injection molded kits where they don't have those kind of guides, so it's a good indication I think of the quality of the tool here and the effort that's gone into it. All of the instructions for the kit are provided as annotated CAD images, usually with just one part to add per step, and there are 30 steps in total. These were generally very clear. As I do when I make injection molded kits, I did swap around some of the steps. In particular, the more delicate parts I left off until the very end. Here's a good example of a very delicate part, the steering linkage. I was a little bit afraid that that might get broken off during the rest of the build process, but it was sturdy enough to survive and the attachment points were strong enough to keep it in place. Because this is a resin kit, we need to use super glue to put things together. I personally prefer the gel type as it gives you a bit more play time, a bit more working time. I mentioned before the slots in the floor of the vehicle, and you'll see now how well they work to guide the addition of these parts. So our seat, for example, goes in there very nicely. While the mount for the machine gun is this cylinder cone-like object which fits into that square gap there. Some parts I did leave separate for painting, so the chair that I showed you earlier and this armour plating that goes on the front. I figured it would be easier to paint the radiator on the inside of that, get that all the right colour, and then put the armour plating on afterwards. I did have a small amount of trouble with the mudguards. They've got this design where we have a tab on the mudguards and they slot into the slot on the main body. The problem is that it is quite hard to 3D print those with precision, and my printer just wasn't really up to it. So although the tab would sort of go into the slot, it wouldn't really let the mudguard go all the way home. The easiest way to solve that was just to chop off that tab and align the mudguards manually. And that worked perfectly well for me. We do have a number of very delicate parts which were quite difficult to attach, as they would be in an injection molded kit. So we've got the flagstaff there. We've got the mirror which I'm attaching here, and we have those very thin fender guard pieces to go on later. This is another small and delicate part which I left off for separate painting. This is the mechanism that holds the machine gun mount and the seat and the ammunition box. We get an MG13 machine gun provided, which is really delicate. And later in their service, these vehicles were also fitted with MG34 machine guns. Here we have all the pieces of the model except for the wheels. I broke the rear suspension piece, which is why that's not attached, because that's in the printer printing still. The door can be positioned open or closed. I think I'm going to have mine open, partly because I really like this map case on the inside of the door there, and I might slot a map or something in there. There we can see our machine gun mount. Only a crew of 2 in this vehicle, the driver and the gunner. And as I said, that mount is separate, the seat is separate, the door is separate, the spare wheel is separate. And here's the broken rear suspension. There should be a couple of tabs on the edge of that. You can see there's just one left there on the end. Unfortunately I broke those off when I was removing the supports from the 3D print. So that's downstairs now printing again. I think part of the problem is that I also do tend to over-cure my 3D prints, and that makes the resin quite brittle. There's an idea of how the wheels will look when they're in place. With that, the model was ready for paint, so I gave it a coat of Halford's car primer, and then a small amount of pre-shading. This is Tamiya XF69 NATO Black, and I applied it mainly to the underside and to areas where I thought it might be quite hard to get paint later, so the radiator grills in particular, and a small amount on the inside of the cabin. Being an interwar and an early war vehicle, we have a couple of colour schemes. I suppose technically we could go for the interwar tricolour scheme, but I think that would look a bit too similar to the late war tricolour scheme. So that leaves us with the German grey base schemes, because as I say, this was withdrawn from service in 1941, which is before the Dunkelgelb and olive green and red-brown scheme came into action. So we've got 2 options, either the dark German grey on its own, or the dark German grey with the dark brown disruptive patches. Many of the reference images I could find do show a 2-colour scheme, as you can see here. I do wonder though, because I read that the German grey scheme should have 1/3 of the vehicle covered in the darker brown colour, and a lot of these reference images look like they've got a lot more than that covered. So I think I'm going to use these as a general guide, but go mainly for the German grey with just some smaller patches of the dark brown. And to achieve that, I'm going to use Tamiya XF63 German grey. And for the dark brown, I'm going to use Tamiya XF64 mixed with a small amount of XF69 to darken it. In terms of decals, I suspect that anyone who's made a couple of vehicles will have some spare decals in their stash. However, looking at these reference images, quite a few of them appear to have no insignia whatsoever. They just have a license plate, and others have these rather nice, rather large white crosses on them. And I think that's what I'm going to go for. I quite like the look of those. Incidentally, the vehicle here in this last image is the Kfz.13, which is the radio communications version of this vehicle. So that bar you can see there around the top is the aerial. And to make way for the radio, the machine gun has been removed. So here's the model once I gave it a coat of XF63 German grey, and those small patches of XF64 plus XF69 for the dark brown. Tamiya's German grey is quite a lot lighter than the AK Real Colours German grey, but I think once we get some weathering and we get a varnish down and everything, I think that will look fine. To break things up a bit, I painted the spare wheel cover in Tamiya XF65 Field Grey. At this stage the tyres don't really stand out much because the XF69 that I used for the rubber is not that different from the XF63 German grey. Nevertheless, I do think that's better than painting them a really solid stark black. Then it was a case of moving on to paint some of the smaller details such as the dashboard and the other driving controls. The seat I initially painted in this saddle brown colour, but the colour was a bit too red and clay-like, so I went over it with a darker brown later. And the same for the gunner's seat. All of these paints that I'm brushing are Vallejo model colour. To give a worn appearance on the anti-slip pattern on the floor of the car, I dry brush some Vallejo metal colour. If I remember correctly, this is their dark aluminium colour. And although only one door opens on the model, I tried to remember to put some wear on the other side as well, because of course the other side has a door. The next step was to paint those big white crosses on the front and the side of the vehicle. My new favourite tool for doing things like this is Tamiya masking sheet, and in particular the version with the grid on it is really useful for this kind of thing. I simply marked out the centre point, marked out where the edges of the crosses wanted to be, and then cut using a hobby blade. I just did all this by eye. You have to keep the lines fairly straight, of course, but to be honest, you can see hand-painted markings on vehicles which are not that straight or level. Rather than risk reusing the same mask and tearing it, I simply cut out 3 separate ones. Here we have the door. And the front grille. I did want to put a license plate on this, so I went for my spare Decals stash and found these from an old Tamiya kit. I can't remember what they were from, but it was one of those vehicles where you get sort of 4 or 5 different options for the license plate, and obviously I only used one of them on the kit. They are ever so slightly bigger than the recessed area for the license plate, but with a bit of Tamiya mark fit, it was all well. I didn't want chipping on the vehicle itself, but I did want it on some of the toolboxes. So I took some Vallejo metal colour on a sponge, got rid of most of the paint, then gently chipped around the edges and the access points. I then gave the whole model a dust coat, with the dust colour formed of XF19 and XF57, which is sky grey and buff. I think with hindsight that dust coat is a little bit too light. It could have done maybe with some flat earth in there, XF52. But nevertheless, I started on the underside and sprayed upwards with just a small amount of dust at the bottom of the doors. It does sort of blend things in fairly well, and it does help blend in the license plate decals as well. But it also means those wheels still don't look brilliant. I should have done the next step before I did the dust coat, but to be honest I completely forgot. I had previously applied a gloss coat, and now it was time for the pin wash. This is Abteilung 502 oil paint sepia, mixed with some odourless thinner, and as you've seen before, applied around the recesses and the details. As is usual with oil paints, you have a lot of working time, so you can always go back and clean up excess with some odourless thinner. I gave a very heavy oil paint wash to things like the seat, which helped to add that sort of worn, dirty look. Once that was dried, I normally leave 24 hours for that process, I applied some TS80, which is Tamiya's rattle can flat coat. These rattle cans can be quite hot, but since it's over Tamiya acrylics, I'm not worried because I know they're nice and compatible. The final step for weathering was to use some pigments. I went for this light dust colour from AK. In this case I didn't use anything to fix the pigments. I find if you use liquid you tend to get a very different texture to the pigment. It tends to look like wet dirt that's run to a location and dried out. And because this has a matte finish, it does have that microscopic texture which tends to cling on to the pigments. Fairly well at least. The pigments are brushed quite heavily onto the wheels, but with a lighter touch on the side of the vehicle and inside the cab. And with those pigments finished, the model was complete. Okay, there we go guys, that was my SD Kfz.13 German Scout Car, printed from a 3D model by Sparty72 from Kultz 3D. And what a fantastic model this was. I'm really pleased with the way this turned out, both in terms of the quality of the model and how it's printed, and with the finish here. I really do like this German grey and dark brown scheme. I had a lot of fun building this. One of the great things about these 3D models is that there are fewer parts and therefore you can get to the painting and weathering stages a lot more quickly. And sometimes I do feel like doing just that, you know, I don't feel like building and making all these sub-assemblies and painting them. I feel like just getting stuck in. I thoroughly enjoyed this kit. I would recommend if you have a resin 3D printer, then you check out the webpage for Sparty72, which is linked in the description below. All that remains for me to say is thank you for watching, and a huge thank you to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters. They have seen the work in progress photos of this and all of the models I've been building, and ones that of course haven't been uploaded yet to YouTube. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, then you can find links to Patreon and YouTube membership in the description below. I've got some more builds coming up of course, and some reviews as well. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. And until next time, have fun modelling.